Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. You look handsome, honey. Emberlyn's voice floated from the doorway. She leaned against the frame, a warm smile playing on her lips. Braylon turned, discomfort evident in his posture. I feel wrong, he admitted, tugging at the collar. Emberlyn crossed the room, wrapping her arms around her husband's waist. I know, sweetie, but it's just for a few days. You'll be back in your favorite dress before you know it. He nodded, leaning into her embrace. I'm just not used to these clothes anymore. It's been so long. And that's okay, Emberlyn reassured him, reaching up to straighten his collar. Remember, your comfort is what matters most. This trip is important for work, but as soon as you're back, we'll have a proper dress-up session. Braylon's lips curved into a small smile. Promise? Cross my heart, Emberlyn replied, mimicking the gesture. Now, let's get your suitcase in the car. You don't want to miss your flight. The couple made their way downstairs, Braylon's steps heavy with reluctance. As they loaded the luggage into the trunk, Emberlyn gave her husband a final hug. Call me when you land, okay? She said, pressing a quick kiss to his cheek. I will, Braylon promised. He climbed into the driver's seat, casting one last glance at their home before pulling out of the driveway. The drive to the airport was uneventful, the radio filling the silence as Braylon's mind wandered. He thought about the contents of his suitcase, the men's clothes he'd packed for the business trip, so different from the colorful dresses and skirts that usually filled his closet. After navigating the bustling airport and enduring the tedious security checks, Braylon found himself seated on the plane, staring out the small window as the ground fell away beneath him. He closed his eyes, trying to find comfort in the familiar hum of the engines. Hours later, Braylon emerged from the airport in a different city, the air thick with humidity. He hailed a taxi, giving the driver the address of his hotel. As they wove through unfamiliar streets, Braylon's phone buzzed with a message from Emberlyn. Hope you landed safely. Miss you already. Remember, you're amazing no matter what you wear. Love you. A smile tugged at Braylon's lips as he typed out a quick reply. The taxi pulled up to the hotel and Braylon stepped out, retrieving his luggage from the trunk. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and presentations. Braylon found himself constantly adjusting his tie, yearning for the soft fabrics and flowing silhouettes he was accustomed to. Each night, he'd video call Emberlyn, finding solace in her understanding words and loving gaze. On the final day of his trip, Braylon breathed a sigh of relief as he packed his suitcase. In just a few hours, he'd be on a plane home, back to the comfort of his true self. He checked out of the hotel and climbed into another taxi, eager to begin his journey back. The taxi merged onto the highway, joining the steady flow of traffic. Braylon leaned his head against the window, watching the unfamiliar cityscape blur past. His mind drifted to thoughts of home, of slipping into his favorite dress, of Emberlyn's warm embrace. Suddenly, a horn blared. Braylon's head snapped up just in time to see a truck swerving into their lane. The taxi driver cursed, jerking the wheel to avoid collision. Time seemed to slow as the car spun, tires screeching against the asphalt. There was a deafening crash, the sickening crunch of metal on metal, and then darkness. Consciousness returned in fragments, muffled voices, the acrid smell of smoke. Pain, sharp and all-encompassing. Braylon's eyes fluttered open, his vision blurry and unfocused. He tried to move but found himself pinned, panic rising in his chest. "Sir, can you hear me?" A voice cut through the haze. "We're going to get you out. Just stay still." Time lost all meaning as Braylon drifted in and out of awareness. He registered the sound of metal being cut, felt hands carefully extricating him from the wreckage. Then he was being lifted, placed on something solid. The world tilted and swayed as he was moved. "Male, mid-30s, severe facial lacerations, possible head trauma," a voice rattled off nearby. "BP is dropping. We need to move fast." Braylon wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but no words came. The pain in his face was overwhelming, and he could taste blood on his lips. As consciousness slipped away once more, a single thought echoed in his mind. What if I'd been wearing a dress? The steady beep of a heart monitor pulled Braylon back to awareness. He blinked, his vision slowly focusing on a stark white ceiling. The antiseptic smell of a hospital filled his nostrils, and he became aware of the dull ache pervading his body. "Mr. Thompson?" A gentle voice spoke from his left. Braylon turned his head, wincing at the movement. A nurse with kind eyes and graying hair stood beside the bed, adjusting something on an IV stand. "Good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" Braylon opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. The nurse quickly offered him a cup of water with a straw. After a few sips, he managed to croak out, "What happened?" "You were in a car accident," the nurse explained, her voice soft and patient. "You've been unconscious for a couple of days. Your wife is on her way. We called her as soon as you were brought in." Relief washed over Braylon at the mention of Emberlyn, quickly followed by a wave of anxiety. "My face," he whispered, reaching up to touch the bandages covering much of his head. The nurse's expression softened further. "You sustained some serious injuries, particularly to your face. The doctors had to perform emergency surgery to address the most pressing issues, but you'll likely need additional procedures." Braylon closed his eyes, trying to process the information. The nurse continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I know it's a lot to take in. For now, just focus on resting and healing. The doctor will be in soon to discuss everything in more detail." As the nurse turned to leave, Braylon found himself blurting out, "Wait!" She paused, looking back at him questioningly. I'm not always like this," he stammered, gesturing weakly at his hospital gown. Understanding dawned in the nurse's eyes. "You mean you sometimes present differently?" she asked, her tone free of judgment. Braylon nodded, relief flooding through him at her perceptiveness. "Yes, I usually wear women's clothes. I was only dressed like this because of the business trip." The nurse smiled warmly. "Thank you for sharing that with me. I want you to know that your identity and how you choose to express yourself doesn't change the care you'll receive here. We're here to support you, no matter how you present." Tears welled up in Braylon's eyes, a mix of pain, relief, and gratitude. The nurse gently patted his hand. "Rest now. Your wife will be here soon, and we'll make sure you have everything you need to feel comfortable." As the nurse left the room, Braylon sank back into the pillows, his mind whirling with thoughts of the accident, his injuries, and the unexpected kindness he'd encountered. Despite the pain and uncertainty, a small spark of hope flickered in his chest. Hours passed in a haze of dozing and brief check-ins from hospital staff. Braylon was vaguely aware of doctors examining him, of quiet discussions about his condition, but it all felt distant and dreamlike. A familiar voice cut through the fog. "Braylon." "Oh, honey." He opened his eyes to see Emberlyn standing by the bed, her face etched with worry and love. She reached out, gently taking his hand in hers. Braylon croaked, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm sorry, Shh," Emberlyn soothed, bringing his hand to her lips. "Don't apologize. I'm just so glad you're alive." Braylon felt tears slipping from beneath his bandages. "My face!" Emberlyn's grip on his hand tightened. "We'll get through this together, okay? No matter what happens, I love you. All of you." A gentle knock at the door interrupted their reunion. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I'm Dr. Reeves. I'd like to discuss Braylon's condition and our recommended course of treatment." Emberlyn pulled a chair close to the bed, never letting go of Braylon's hand as the doctor began to explain. "The accident caused significant trauma to your facial structure," Dr. Reeves said, his tone professional but compassionate. "We've addressed the most critical injuries, But you'll need additional surgeries to fully reconstruct the damaged areas. Braylon listened, a mix of fear and numbness washing over him as the doctor detailed the extent of his injuries and the proposed treatments. As Dr. Reeves finished his explanation, a thought struck Braylon. "Doctor," he began hesitantly, "if I need to have more surgeries anyway, would it be possible to make some changes?" Dr. Reeves raised an eyebrow. "What kind of changes did you have in mind?" Braylon swallowed hard, glancing at Emberlyn. She squeezed his hand encouragingly. I've always felt more comfortable presenting as a woman," he admitted. "If I'm going to need facial reconstruction, could we make my face more feminine?" The doctor's expression remained neutral, but his voice was kind. "It's not an unusual request, especially in cases like yours where extensive reconstruction is needed anyway. We have specialists who can work with you to achieve the look you desire while addressing the injuries from the accident." Relief washed over Braylon. He turned to Emberlyn, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. Instead, he found only love and support shining in her eyes. "Is this really what you want?" she asked softly. Braylon nodded, feeling more certain than he ever had before. I think the accident made me realize life's too short to not be true to myself." Emberlyn smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Then we'll do it, together." Dr. Reeves cleared his throat gently. "If this is the route you'd like to take, I'll arrange for you to meet with our facial feminization specialist. They can discuss the possibilities and help create a treatment plan that addresses both your medical needs and your personal goals." As the doctor left to make the arrangements, Braylon felt a weight lift from his chest. Despite the pain and uncertainty ahead, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. The weeks that followed were a blur of surgeries, recovery periods, and consultations. Braylon, with Emberlyn's unwavering support, worked closely with the medical team to plan each step of his transformation. The physical pain was often intense, but it was matched by an equally powerful sense of anticipation and hope. As Braylon's face began to heal and change, so too did his perspective on his identity. What had once been a private form of expression began to feel like his true self emerging. With each passing day, the person in the mirror aligned more closely with the person he'd always felt he was inside. It was during one of his many follow-up appointments that Braylon broached the subject that had been on his mind for weeks. Dr. Reeves had just finished examining his latest surgical sites, nodding with satisfaction at the healing progress. "Doctor," Braylon began, his voice soft but determined. "I've been thinking about taking the next step." Dr. Reeves looked up from his notes. "What did you have in mind?" Braylon took a deep breath. "Hormones. I want to start hormone replacement therapy." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "It's a big decision, but not an uncommon one for someone in your position. Have you discussed this with your wife?" "We've talked about it," Braylon confirmed. "She's supportive, as always. I feel like I'm finally becoming who I was always meant to be. I want to embrace that fully." Dr. Reeves smiled. "I understand. I'll refer you to an endocrinologist who specializes in transgender care. They'll be able to guide you through the process and help you make an informed decision." As Braylon left the hospital that day, he felt a surge of excitement and nervous energy. He was stepping into uncharted territory, but for the first time in his life, it felt right. The hormone therapy brought its own set of challenges and changes. Braylon watched in awe as his body slowly transformed, softening in some areas, reshaping in others. There were mood swings and moments of doubt, but through it all, Emberlyn remained his rock, offering love and reassurance. It was during this time that Braylon made another important decision. As his outward appearance aligned more and more with his inner self, he felt the need for a name that reflected his true identity. "Mayzie," he said one evening as he and Emberlyn sat on their porch watching the sunset. "I'd like to be called Mayzie." Emberlyn turned to him, a soft smile on her face. "Mayzie," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "It suits you. It's beautiful, just like you." Mayzie felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the love and acceptance radiating from her wife. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning in to rest her head on Emberlyn's shoulder. "For everything." As the months passed, Maisie's confidence grew. She began venturing out in public, at first nervously, then with increasing assurance. The stares and whispers she had once feared rarely materialized, and when they did, she found she had the strength to hold her head high. It was on a crisp day, nearly a year after the accident, that Mayzie found herself back at the hospital for a final checkup. As she sat in the waiting room, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her to this point. A familiar face appeared in the doorway, the kind nurse who had been there when she first woke up after the accident. The nurse's eyes widened in recognition, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Well, look at you," she said, approaching Mayzie. "You look wonderful. How are you feeling?" Mayzie stood, smoothing down her floral dress. "I feel like myself," she replied, her voice full of emotion. "I never thought I'd say this, but that accident, it changed my life in ways I never could have imagined." The nurse nodded understandingly. "Sometimes the most challenging moments in our lives can lead us to our truest selves. I'm so glad to see you thriving." Impulsively, Mayzie reached out and hugged the nurse. "Thank you," she whispered. "Your kindness that day, it meant more than you know." As Mayzie left the hospital for the last time, she felt a sense of closure. The accident that had once seemed like the worst moment of her life had become the catalyst for her transformation. She had faced her fears, embraced her true self, and found strength she never knew she possessed. Emberlyn was waiting in the car, a bright smile on her face as Mayzie approached. As she slid into the passenger seat, Mayzie felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. "Ready to go home?" Emberlyn asked, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Mayzie nodded, her heart full. "More than ready, let's start the rest of our lives." As they pulled away from the hospital, Mayzie looked back one last time. The building that had once represented pain and fear now stood as a symbol of rebirth and self-discovery. With a contented sigh, she turned her gaze forward, eager to embrace whatever the future might hold. The drive home was filled with comfortable silence, broken only by the soft melodies drifting from the car radio. Mayzie watched the familiar streets pass by, each turn bringing them closer to the home she shared with Emberlyn. It struck her how different everything looked now, not because the world had changed, but because she saw it through new eyes. As they pulled into their driveway, Emberlyn turned off the engine and turned to face Mayzie. "How about we celebrate tonight?" she suggested, a mischievous glint in her eye. "I may have planned a little surprise for you." Mayzie raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, what kind of surprise?" Emberlyn just smiled, climbing out of the car. "You'll see. Come on, let's get inside." As they entered the house, Mayzie was immediately struck by the scent of her favorite meal wafting from the kitchen. Candles flickered on the dining room table, which was set for two with their best china. Mayzie breathed, taking in the scene. "You didn't have to do all this." Emberlyn wrapped her arms around Maisie's waist from behind, resting her chin on her shoulder. "I wanted to. This is a big day. The end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It deserves to be celebrated." Tears pricked at Maisie's eyes as she turned in her wife's embrace. "I love you so much," she whispered. "I love you too," Emberlyn replied, her eyes shining with affection. "Now, go get changed. I left something for you on the bed." Curious, Mayzie made her way upstairs to their bedroom. Laid out on the bed was a stunning emerald green dress, one she had admired in a shop window weeks ago but hadn't bought, feeling it was too extravagant. Her heart swelling with emotion, Mayzie slipped into the dress, marveling at how perfectly it fit. She applied a touch of makeup, taking a moment to study her reflection in the mirror. The face that looked back at her was softer now, with delicate features that felt true to who she was inside. For the first time in her life, she felt completely at home in her own skin. Downstairs, Emberlyn was lighting the last of the candles when Mayzie descended the stairs. She looked up, her breath catching at the sight of her wife. "You look absolutely beautiful," Emberlyn said, crossing the room to take Maisie's hands in hers. Mayzie blushed, the compliment warming her from the inside out. "Thank you. For everything. I don't know how I got so lucky." They sat down to dinner, the conversation flowing easily between them as it always had. They reminisced about the past year, the challenges they'd faced, the moments of doubt, and the triumphs they'd shared. As they finished their meal, Emberlyn reached across the table to take Maisie's hand. "I have one more surprise for you," she said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "Another one?" Mayzie asked, laughing softly. You've already done so much." Emberlyn smiled, reaching into her pocket with her free hand. She pulled out a small velvet box, placing it on the table between them. Maisie's eyes widened as she recognized the shape. "I know we're already married," Emberlyn began, her voice thick with emotion. "But I thought maybe you'd like to renew our vows, as Mayzie, as your true self." With trembling fingers, Mayzie opened the box to reveal a delicate ring, its band inlaid with small emeralds that matched her dress perfectly. "Oh, Em," she breathed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Emberlyn stood, moving around the table to slip the ring onto Maisie's finger. They embraced, both crying and laughing at the same time. As they held each other, Mayzie marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. The accident that had once seemed like a tragedy had set her on a path to self-discovery and true happiness. She had faced her fears, embraced her authentic self, and found a depth of love and acceptance she never thought possible. "Thank you," Mayzie whispered into Emberlyn's hair, "for loving all of me, for supporting me through everything." Emberlyn pulled back slightly, cupping Maisie's face in her hands. "Loving you is the easiest thing in the world," she said softly. "You're the bravest, most beautiful person I know, inside and out." As they sealed their renewed commitment, Mayzie felt a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead might still have its challenges, but she knew that with Emberlyn by her side, she could face anything. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Mayzie found herself reflecting on the twists and turns that had led her to this point. The fear she'd once felt about being true to herself seemed like a distant memory now. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Emberlyn murmured, tracing lazy patterns on Maisie's arm. Mayzie smiled, turning to face her wife. "I was just thinking about how sometimes the things we fear the most can lead us to where we're meant to be. I spent so long worried about what would happen if I had an accident while dressed as a woman. And then when it actually happened, when I was dressed as a man, it became the catalyst for me to become my true self." Emberlyn nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Life has a funny way of working out sometimes." "It really does," Mayzie agreed. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "You know, I keep thinking about that nurse. The one who was there when I first woke up in the hospital. Her kindness, it made such a difference. It gave me hope when I needed it most. We should find a way to thank her," Emberlyn suggested. "Maybe make a donation to the hospital in her name." Maisie's face lit up at the idea. "That's perfect. And maybe we could start a fund to help other people who might be in similar situations, to let them know they're not alone." Emberlyn leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to Maisie's forehead. "I think that's a wonderful idea. We could call it the Phoenix Fund, rising from the ashes and all that." Mayzie laughed softly, snuggling closer to her wife. "I like it. It's a new beginning, isn't it? For us, and hopefully for others too." Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.